Most people believe freedom is something that gets taken, that one day, suddenly, someone shows up and removes it. That's not how it works. Real control never arrives with force. It arrives with permission. Throughout history, the most effective systems of control were never imposed overnight. They were accepted slowly, step by step, because they felt useful, protective, or necessary at the time. And the most dangerous truth is this: people don't lose freedom when they resist. They lose it when they comply. Let's start with Rome. At its peak, Rome was not conquered from the outside. It collapsed from within through incentives that quietly rewired behavior. Citizens were given grain distributions, public entertainment, and financial relief in exchange for loyalty and silence. The Roman state didn't need constant violence. It made dependency comfortable. Bread and circuses wasn't about distraction. It was about conditioning. Once survival depends on a system, questioning that system feels dangerous. Fast forward to medieval Europe. Serfs weren't chained. They weren't prisoners. They were protected. Landowners offered security, food, and shelter in exchange for labor and obedience. Over time, generations were born into this arrangement and stopped seeing it as control. It simply became how life works. Ownership disappeared long before freedom did. And once ownership was gone, freedom followed naturally. Now jump to the 20th century. In 1933, during the Great Depression, Americans were ordered to turn in their gold. Not because gold was evil, but because the government needed control over monetary stability. People complied, not because they were threatened, but because they were afraid. Fear makes compliance feel rational. Later, in war economies across Europe, ration cards were introduced. Again, not as punishment, but as protection. The state decided who could buy what, how much, and when. Citizens lined up, they showed their papers, they followed the rules. And once war ended, those systems didn't fully disappear. They evolved. The lesson from history is simple and uncomfortable. Control never begins with restriction. It begins with assistance. Now look at the modern world. We're told that systems exist to make life easier, faster, safer, more efficient. Digital banking removes friction. Smart IDs remove inconvenience. Cashless payments remove risk. Automated systems remove human error. Every step feels logical in isolation, but together they form something new. A world where permission replaces ownership, where access replaces freedom, and where compliance replaces choice. You don't need chains when access can be revoked. In China, the social credit system didn't begin as surveillance. It began as trust scoring, a way to reward good behavior. Faster loans, better travel access, priority services. The punishment wasn't jail. The punishment was exclusion. You could still live, just not fully. History shows this pattern again and again. In the Soviet Union, ration access depended on political alignment. In East Germany, travel depended on loyalty. In Venezuela, food access became tied to digital ID cards. None of these systems started as oppression. They started as solutions. That's the critical point most people miss. No system announces itself as control. It announces itself as help. And once people rely on it, opting out becomes impossible. Because the moment you depend on a system for food, money, shelter, or movement, resistance becomes self-destructive. This is why freedom doesn't collapse in a moment. It erodes quietly. The system doesn't need to take your freedom. You give it away, piece by piece, because each trade feels reasonable at the time. And by the time people realize what they've lost, they no longer have the leverage to fight back. That's not an accident. That's design. Once ownership disappears, power doesn't need to be enforced anymore. It manages itself. History makes this brutally clear. After World War II, many European countries rebuilt their economies by expanding state control over housing, banking, and industry. At first it was framed as recovery, stability, protection against chaos. People welcomed it. They were exhausted. They wanted certainty. But what followed wasn't freedom. It was conditional access. In Britain, public housing expanded rapidly. Millions lived in homes they didn't own, controlled by councils that could change terms, rents, and eligibility. You could live there, as long as you followed the rules. The moment you didn't, access could disappear. Ownership wasn't taken, it was replaced. The same pattern played out with money. When the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, the dollar was fully detached from gold. For the first time in modern history, money was no longer a claim on something real. It became a permission slip, valid only because institutions said it was. People didn't protest. They didn't even notice, because nothing felt different at first. Inflation came later. Asset prices exploded later. Dependency came later. The system always delays consequences, long enough for behavior to lock in. This is the part most people misunderstand. Control doesn't come from force, it comes from irreversibility. Once a society restructures around systems it can't function without, no one needs to impose obedience. Disobedience becomes impractical. Look at modern banking. Your money isn't held by you. It's held by institutions that can freeze accounts, reverse transactions, and deny access, often without explanation. This isn't theoretical, it's already happening. In 2019, protesters in Hong Kong discovered that donations to certain causes led to frozen bank accounts. In Canada, during the trucker protests in 2022, financial access was cut for participants and supporters. No trial, no conviction, just administrative action. The system didn't punish crime, it restricted access. That's the new enforcement mechanism. In ancient times, punishment was physical. In modern systems, punishment is exclusion. You're not jailed, you're disconnected. Disconnected from banking, disconnected from travel, disconnected from commerce. And because everything runs through centralized systems, exclusion doesn't need to be permanent to be effective. Temporary denial is enough to break resistance. Now combine this with digital identity. Historically, identity was local, paper-based, fragmented, hard to synchronize. Control was limited by bureaucracy. Digital identity changes that. When identity, money, movement, and access merge into a single system, power becomes seamless, invisible, frictionless. You don't need guards, you need permissions. This is why cash is being quietly removed. Cash isn't anonymous because it's criminal. It's dangerous because it's independent. Cash doesn't ask permission. Cash doesn't log behavior. Cash doesn't care who you are. That makes it incompatible with a system built on oversight. In India, demonetization wiped out cash overnight in 2016. The justification was corruption. The result was chaos for ordinary people, while those with digital access adapted quickly. Informal workers suffered the most. The poor paid the price. History repeats the same lesson. When systems change suddenly, those without assets absorb the shock. The middle class doesn't revolt when ownership erodes slowly. They adjust. They accept subscriptions instead of property, licenses instead of rights, access instead of possession. Music became streaming, software became subscriptions, cars became leases, homes became financial instruments. Each change made sense alone. Together, they created a society where nothing is truly owned, only rented, allowed, or permitted. And once everything requires permission, permission becomes leverage. That's the endgame history always points to. Not tyranny, not dictatorship, but dependency so complete that resistance no longer makes sense. People don't fight systems they rely on to survive. They defend them. Every system that removes ownership eventually reveals why it was removed. Not to protect people, but to manage behavior. Once you stop owning assets, your leverage disappears. You can't opt out. You can't wait it out. You can't stand still. History shows this pattern over and over. In ancient Rome, small landowners formed the backbone of the republic. They owned land, fed themselves, and could walk away from politics if they chose. As Rome expanded, land slowly consolidated into massive estates called latifundia, owned by elites and worked by slaves. The middle class vanished. Citizens who once owned land became dependent on state grain distributions. Bread replaced property. Access replaced independence. Political loyalty followed naturally. Rome didn't collapse because of violence first. It collapsed because ownership concentration hollowed out society. The same mechanism appeared in medieval Europe. Serfs didn't own land. They were allowed to use it in exchange for obedience, labor, and taxes. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They lived at the mercy of permissions. That system lasted centuries because it didn't feel like oppression. It felt like normal life. Fast forward to the 20th century. After the Russian Revolution, private property was abolished in the name of equality. Housing, farms, factories, everything became state-owned. Citizens were provided for, but without ownership, people had no bargaining power, no fallback, no independence. If you lost favor, you didn't lose rights. You lost access, your apartment, your ration card, your job. Ownership had been replaced with conditional survival. Today's systems don't look like that. Yet, they don't need to. Modern control doesn't confiscate. It redefines. You don't lose your house, you refinance it forever. You don't lose your money, you inflate it. You don't lose your freedom. You exchange it for convenience. Each step feels optional, until none of them are. This is why financialization matters so much. When housing becomes an investment vehicle instead of shelter, people stop owning homes and start servicing debt. And when debt becomes permanent, people stop accumulating assets and start maintaining eligibility. Eligibility for credit, eligibility for insurance, eligibility for platforms. Miss one payment, lose access. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a structure. And structures don't need villains. They function on incentives. Governments don't need to ban ownership outright. They just need to make it impractical. High taxes, high compliance costs, endless regulation, rising asset prices. Ownership becomes a privilege for institutions, not individuals. This is why the middle class always shrinks quietly. Not because people get poorer overnight, but because they stop accumulating real assets. They work more, they earn more, they own less. And because nothing is taken directly, there's nothing obvious to fight. History's most effective systems never announce themselves. They normalize. By the time people realize what's gone, it's already been replaced with something harder to live without. That's the real danger, not collapse, not crisis. But a future where independence feels unrealistic. And once independence feels unrealistic, permission becomes survival. If you who are watching this and trying to understand what S actually happening beneath the noise, the patterns, not the headlines, you're already ahead of most people. This channel exists to connect those patterns, using history as a map. Not fear, not hype, just clarity. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe. Not because things are ending, but because understanding systems is how you stay ahead of them.